Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to part 2 of building a full stack CRUD app from scratch. In the last video, which will be linked in the description below. By the way, make sure to comment and subscribe and like this video. We started with a blank directory, and I got this sucker up and running to have a React client-side project running and a Node Express server running on the back end that served up that static site. Now, there's really not a whole lot of optimizations and things added into this particular project, but again, this is more about just building a full stack app from scratch and not talking about like production level optimizations and things like that. If there is interest, I will have to do some digging into that myself. But let's just kind of pick up where we left off. We had it running with a basic bare bones server, and from here, the goal is to basically keep on coding out this project and kind of making some choices along the way, discussing choices along the way, reading the comments, learning new things about myself and how I write my code, and kind of going from there. So I like to typically start on the database side of things, but I mentioned at the first video that you didn't have to be exclusively and extremely competent at MySQL stuff. And I'm ready to get in there and do some goofing around with that, but at the moment, I'm going to focus more on just building out my server-side structure. If you recall, with our umbrella approach to the TS config, where this top-level TS config is talking to both a server and client config, the TS configs, we're looking for the type roots at the server types folder. So I need to add a types folder, and within which I can have any kind of files I want. I'll just start with like an index.ts that I will end up placing some types in at some port that I can use across my project, export around, or whatever I need for the server. Okay, something else I will typically do is add a config folder. I like having a config object that has a lot of my environment variables stored within it. I also will have a database folder. That's where I'm going to code out, surprise, my database connection and the number of queries. I might save that one for a separate video, since that one, it will also take some time to explain why we might choose an ORM overriding everything ourselves, and vice versa as well. Like with, especially on server-side development, everything is a trade-off. Well, all coding, really. Everything is a trade-off. We write it ourselves, we're going to have to write a lot of catches and niche case scenarios and edge cases in our code, and adding tons and tons of features ourselves. We can learn a lot, but it could be a lot of work that a library or package might just handle for us. On the flip side, the library or package will eventually run into some weird niche or edge case scenario that doesn't happen to help what we are using it for, which means we're going to have to code a feature around it rather than using it. So it could become a hindrance in some projects, depending on what we're trying to do. Anyway, I will go ahead and add a middlewares folder as well, because middlewares are what make the world go round when it comes to Express and routes and stuff like that. Speaking of which, we're going to have our routes folder here as well, because we're going to have a whole bunch of nested routing. And I always like making a utils folder, because I'm sure we're going to have some things with like bcrypt, or maybe with some kind of, I don't know, but we'll see. Like, I'm sure there's going to be some kind of utilities we're going to be using, and I like having them stored in a singular place. As far as that being written out here, let's go ahead and install some packages, because I think at the moment all I have are, the bare minimum dependencies installed for this sucker right here. So when it comes to packages, there's a couple that I like to do. For server-side development, I very much like having a couple middlewares. I know there is one called Morgan that I use for a lot of my logs. Like, this is a very nice little logging middleware that you can add to your Express servers that will log a lot of whatever requests are coming into it. And you can have different kinds of logs, like clean readable logs, to like full information about like what kind of browser even made the request, what time, method, status response, how long it took, all that kind of stuff. It's really good in debugging problems when you're hitting your endpoints and you're wondering where something might be going wrong. Something else I also like to include would be Passport. I mean, we don't have to do Passport for auth. I may include it here, though, because it does streamline certain things, but it does complicate other things. We're going to go ahead and install it, because I'm going to assume we're going to use it. And again, like I mentioned, that this is kind of meant for some students that finish our curriculum and they're looking for additional help and reasons of why they do things the way we do. I'll go ahead and install Passport, and I'm going to leave it up in the air if I'm going to actually use it or not. So we're also going to, I know I can probably do this all in one line, but I'm trying to like kind of reason out why I'm adding certain things the way I'm adding them. So we'll get there in a minute. Let's see. we are also going to include, why am I blanking on the name of it? .env, my goodness, .env. And if you notice, I don't do a @types package for @types/.env. It comes with its own TypeScript typings. How do I know? It's because I've installed this many a time, and I used to do @types.env, and you'll get like a little npm warning saying, hey, this is actually a deprecated package because the library comes with its own dedicated typings now, so just use that, lol. Okay, that's a good couple installs for now. And I guess we'll install just JK, says guy that says it's good for now. Let's go ahead and install MySQL in case I get to that part in this part of the video. There we go. Looking good in the neighborhood, if I do say so myself. Let's go ahead and code out some environment variables. So I don't have anything that's like important as of right now for environment variables. But let's go ahead and start coding that piece of the project out. I'm going to include in the root of my project now a .env file that will be corresponding to my development environment variables. Because when we actually get in this video series to the deployment side to deploy into actual production, we will have a different environment variable file that this project will depend upon in order to run. So here I could just include something like the following. Test equals LOL in this file. And important, very, very important, everybody, go to your git ignore right now. And oh, look at that previous video. I was smart and thought ahead and just added this here just to make sure I was safe. So now we gotta make sure that when I push this, I don't actually push this .env file. Okay, so we got that going. Let's go to our server config, and we're gonna add an index file inside of that, an index.ts file. We're gonna import .env from .env. We're going to load it up by saying .env.config. This is where you can pass it some options, including like a custom path to a file. But if you pass it no configuration object to the config function, it will simply look for that .env file at the root of the project. So I'm going to make sure this thing is actually working the way it should be by adding a quick console log that will do a process.env, if I can type, .test. And this console log should tell me whether or not the actual in the environment variable file and the .env library are doing its job correctly. It should log LOL from that file. As of right now, this file isn't in use anywhere, so if I do run this project with npm run dev, we're up and running, but we don't see any kind of log coming up even after it rebuilds or whatever, right? And then the server reruns. That's because this, even though this console log code is written here, this index file isn't actually being ran or referenced anywhere when it comes to running my server. So what I like to do is I like to add just quick tests here. I will simply write one of the following. And this is what's pretty cool about TypeScript, is that I can write a import statement and not actually import a module from said file. I can simply import a path to the file. And in this case, when it comes to JavaScript in general, this is not just a TypeScript thing, I don't have to write /index, if you guys know this trick already. If the index file is an entry point to folders or directories in code, right? So I don't have to write, hey, go to the config folder and find the index.ts file, because it by itself will be automatically be looked for. As a matter of fact, even if I use VS Code's IntelliSense and highlight over it, I can see right there that it's automatically looking for that configuration index file in that directory. And that's a really cool trick to shorthand your imports and make you look like a cool kid, which is what I'm all about. But this is a really cool feature in TypeScript where I can write an import to a file path, and what it ends up doing is running that file for me. So this is how I'm going to be testing it. And yeah, there's my LOL. Ignore the crash not found. That's when I was pointing out what happens if you write / why we don't need to write / index, and I stopped typing, my autosave kicked on, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, check it out. My .env is up and running, so we have environment variables ready to go. Looking good. That's what I'm talking about, y'all. From there, let's actually go ahead and code out a couple of routes here. So here we go. The way I like to organize this, and this is not necessarily the way you have to do it, but again, if you're following along with me, you're probably going to be just following what I do and not making changes or decisions along the way that alter for me. That way you can kind of follow along with this walkthrough, but if you're feeling brave, go for it. Here's my little setup that I like to do. I like to separate my API and my auth routes, because a lot of times in like larger scale or like headless projects where you're building out a server like a REST API, you might be just using Google OAuth or something like that. Like, Auth logic I like to sequester on its own, since it tends to get complex when you need to keep it as simple as possible and as strong as possible. So I'm going to keep them in separate folders, even though I could house everything under the API folder and call it a day. We're going to try and take a little extra approach here to link them together. This index file will be, again, the entry point to the routes folder, and its purpose will be to link the API and auth routes under one router that we can export from here. But before I get into that, let's actually go and code them out. I'm going to make another index file. Its index is all the way down, folks. Trust me. We're going to make another index file in the auth folder that will then link all individual auth routes. One of those, for example, will be a login router of some kind. So I'm going to make a login TS file here. And finally, we're going to write some code. We're going to write import, and let's import the router from the Express library. I need to make a new router in this particular file. This is done so by invoking the router function that comes from the Express library. It gives you a fully configured router, able to use middleware. It's really freaking awesome. And before I forget, I'll go ahead and export it out of this file. And now let's go ahead and add a test. We're going to do a post request because that verb, that HTTP method, is what we're going to be using for sending JSON bodies of data to our route to test it here. It's going to have the path of /login because that just makes sense to me. At the moment, it will have no middleware, but we are going to simply do a recResNext callback function. This function is the action that runs upon making a request to this API endpoint or this auth endpoint. And all I want it to do is to let me know that it's working. So I want to give myself just a text JSON response that says login woot. So when we actually get to testing this in Postman, I would know it's connected and ready to go. So that is what my simple login router is going to look like. At the moment, it's not actually connected to anything. I've exported this router out, but I have not imported anywhere to test yet. So the first step I'm going to do is link it into my auth index. What I'll do is, surprise, surprise, import another router from Express, because routers can stack on top of routers. Beautiful stuff. Const router is a call to the router function. Export it out before I forget. And then what I'm going to do is import the login router from the login file. And remember, folks, when I do a default level export, I'm exporting not the name of the variable, aka lowercase r router. I'm simply exporting out what it does, and I can choose to import it under a pseudonym, for example, login router. I don't have to write import lowercase router from login because that would cause a naming variable problem here anyway. So this is a default export, not a named export. So what I'll do from there is simply stack on stack this router. Router.use of the path login, use the logic of the login router. And I realize now I've put myself in a conundrum. Login/login, that means the full path here would be a post request to currently nothing /login/login. So as a matter of fact, I can ditch the login keyword right there and leave it to a /. That way that ends up being the route here. That's what I should actually do. This is where I'm going to put the login path name. There we go. Yeah, that makes more sense to me. Okay, now this auth router is now wired up with the post login request, but it's still not added to my main router. So we're going to head up to, and I know this is going to get confusing, so I'm going to collapse that folder there, the routes index file. Now we'll all write the exact same code. From Express Areno, make a new router. There we go. Export that sucker out before we forget. It's a nasty habit of mine, which is why I tend to write it that way. We're going to now import that auth router as the following. Auth router from /auth directory. I don't have to write /index because that's implied. It's so cool. Router.use on the path of auth. Use the logic of the auth router. And there we go. Now we're all connected. So the full path is /auth, /login, /post request. So all we have to do is hit that API endpoint up, and I keep calling it API endpoint, that endpoint up, and we should be about ready to test. So let's see. This is now wired up correctly. I'm going to close out these files up here because they're starting to pollute everything. But what we do have to remember is it still has yet to be imported here into my main server file. So we're going to say import my router or routes from the routes index file that will both have my API requests and my auth requests added to them, okay? So we have this silly API endpoint we've been testing right here, so let's just get rid of that and say, hey app, I would like you to use whatever routes came from that imported router. And there we go. So there's our beautiful little server here, which should be good to go. Looks like it's up and running with no errors, but let's see if it actually works. So I want to open up Postman. This is the point in the video that if you need to pause and install Postman or open up your own route testing, there's a couple free ones online. There's in-browser ones. One used to be called Postman. I don't know what they changed it to. I think it's Scotch something. Looks like I haven't been here in a hot minute. I'll update that later. But okay, what we're going to do actually is we're going to open not just a new request to test this with. I'm actually going to open a new project, a new workspace. We're going to add YouTube CRUD app series. There we go. And that's what I'm going to call it. So in my YouTube CRUD app series, what we're going to do is add not a new request yet, but we're going to add a new folder. We're going to call this folder the auth folder because it's going to, surprise, surprise, represent the auth requests. And inside of here, I'll add a request that will finally be what I need it to be, which is my post request. So it's going to be a post request to localhost 3000. I'm pretty sure is what I'm running on. Let's double check. Yeah, port 3000. And what we're going to do is run to auth/login, and this request should send us that response, which is the login woot right there. So I can't really zoom in on that, but check it out. It's there. So it looks like the router is now set up correctly. What I'm going to actually do here is save this request. I should probably give it a better name. We'll call it the login request. There we go. So now if I look in my collections, I can bring this up very, very quickly. If I ever need to make a login request, eventually we'll come here and actually add a request body, which we may do here in just a moment, and actually save that request for ourselves. That way we can quickly test our routes, and we can even write, and I might even invite Andrew on, my co-instructor at Covalence. He's actually a wizard on Postman, much more so than me. Maybe he'll show us some cool things we could do. Like maybe he'll live teach me through how to do some cool things with Postman to test a series of API endpoints with just a single button click here in Postman, which I think is awesome. Anyway, it looks like it worked just fine. So let's go start adding some more things to our server, right? Because at the moment, you know what? Let's do this. Let's check this out. I want to be able to test sending a JSON body to my login router, because eventually it's going to have to say, hey, this user is trying to log in. And that is represented by the request.body, aka rec.body. So let's go ahead and see what happens if, for example, I do the following bit of code. I will change the response from a simple string to an object that maybe says user info. And what I want it to do is simply tell me what properties are on the request body like that, right? And I realized that, yeah, there we go. You know what, let's just send the rec body. What am I trying to make copies and things for? I don't need to do anything. Let's just send the request body directly, and let's see what the object structure ends up looking like, because I'm honestly curious to see what it ends up doing. So at the moment, let's see what happens and what gets sent. I'm going to click on the body tab here in Postman. We're going to go to raw, drop down JSON, and a typical login request will probably have their email, which we'll do test@test.com, and a lovely password of, let's say, password123. That's going to be my request body right there. Make sure you don't have any trailing commas. Even the properties in JSON format must be in double quotes. Remember that, folks. Send it, and we see nothing. Well, that's interesting. Let's go back over here and maybe add a console log. Maybe for some reason it's not a format type that's looking or appearing correctly in Postman. Let's go make this request again. I'm going to give my server a second to restart. Send request. Still see nothing. And we see undefined in the console log. Well, that's interesting. For my students or for savvy folks out there, this is because we don't have a body parser. New band name, called it. We don't have a body parser installed. Matter of fact, Express comes with a couple basic body parsers on there for us. And we have to make sure that our server, our application itself, is using this body parser somewhere before the routes. Theoretically, I can simply come here and add Express body parser for JSON bodies as a middleware just for this route. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's going to be plenty of other locations in my routes, my endpoints, that I'm going to need a body parser for post and put requests mostly. So I'm actually going to add it at a application level, and it is called express.json. There we go. And that's all we need. There's another one also called express.url encoded. That's for, well, URL encoded, like form submit syntaxes. But I'm going to make this a full JSON only REST API and not even mess with that particular body parser until it bites me in the rear end like things tend to do. So there we go. Now with that little body parser action added there, let's see the difference. There we go. It sent me back my JSON body, so now I know that I can start sending post and put requests that contain bodies with them. I'm going to go ahead and save this request because this will be a login attempt we're going to do down the line. No problemo. While I'm here, I'm actually looking at my apps.listen 3000. That's actually going to be an issue I know when it comes to deployment, so what I'm actually going to do is move this to an environment variable. I'm going to add here, instead of just test LOL, let's actually add port equals 3000, because this port, clearly we're not going to be given port 3000 in production when we get there, which I'll talk about more when I arrive at that video, whenever that happens to be. But eventually we're going to be running our code somewhere that will not be running on port 3000, so we have to make sure that is interchangeable between production and development. So what I'm going to do is change it in my env file, head to my config index, and what we're going to do is we're going to export out a default object that will have a port. Yeah, the support property. That makes sense to me. Maybe I'll call it like app, like a sub property. Like these will be anything from my app in particular. App port, which will be process.env.port, will be provided to us by wherever we deploy. It's looking like Heroku or Render for this video series, if y'all are interested. So there's our port available to us, which means now I have to import it over here. I will say import the config file from the config folder and replace this hard-coded 3000 with a config.app.port, like that. And I'll do the same thing over here in my console log to make sure it's represented correctly by switching it to a template literal and replacing the 3000 with an interpolation of the same value, config.app.port, to make sure it's appearing the way I expect it to. Looks like the server's up and running on port 3000 with no issues whatsoever, so we have successfully switched to a better scaling port value. So good stuff. Okay. Okie dokie. Let's go ahead and also maybe add to ourselves. Let's go ahead and start up the API router as well. Let's go ahead and get an API route up and running. So we're going to have an API route where we're going to have our index file here. I'm going to go ahead and just write out this code and get it on copy and paste. Since y'all saw on the auth side, there was a lot of repetitive code. So I'll go ahead and just do this to save myself the trouble. Like so. Export default router. Stop it. Stop it. I've fat fingered an autocomplete there. Copy paste this code because we're going to build it out a few more times, as you know. Let's make a new file in my API router, where feasibly I will, considering this is a DnD note-taking app, I figure I'll be getting all and singular notes for different views and editing them and deleting them. So I'm going to make a notes.ts file in my API folder. And we're going to make a GET request in this case. Rec res and next. Bada bing, bada boom. Res.json. This will be probably a get all notes request. So the path here would be a get request to, in my case, it'll be API /notes / and that should send this response here, right? That's what I'm looking to do here. And you don't have to add these comments above your routes, but I've learned teaching over like the 6 years I've been at Covalence that it helps students that aren't quite familiar with server-side development kind of keep things, remembering how these things are built out. So, adding these comments here just kind of helps the newer students know how these routes are stacking on top of each other. So, okay, we got our notes router ready to go, which means I can now import it over yonder. Import notes router from the notes file and stack it on top of this router. And we'll call it /notes. That's where that part of the route will come from. There we go. And now this API router has a notes pile in it. Hello, Percival. Want to come say hi for the camera? This is my cat, Percival. Anyone that's been in my course, in the full stack development course or my React course, which are both available on covalence.io, go check it out if you're interested in those. He likes to make appearances regularly, but only at really inconveniencing times. It's like he just knows. I think there's a video that my coworker Jackson sent me about like how to make good YouTube videos, which clearly I don't, or maybe I do. Get in the comments, let me know. Never have a cat if you want to be a YouTuber or content creator, because they have a way of bugging you and ruining things and digging in the litter box or destroying something behind the green screen. It makes me pause and edit the video out. But looks like he's just going to go lay down next to my side monitor so I can't see my own notes. Perfect. Speaking of notes, let's come back over here. So that's where the notes part of the route is going to come from, but now I have to wire up this API router into my root index. So just like before, I'm going to collapse that folder for visual sake, click on this index, I'm going to copy and paste these 2 lines of code, find the word auth here and change it to API for some quick stuff, and same thing down here like that. That was a little command. I use Control-D on Windows, it's Command-D on Mac. It highlights, your VS Code editor will show you these highlights where all these things are, and you can use Control-D to place a text cursor there. It's like a fancy and fast find and replace, but just be careful with it. Anyway, I have those 2 routers up and ready to go now, which is pretty freaking awesome. And let's go ahead and add a new request to test it out with, shall we? Let's open up that workspace, collapse that, right-click, add folder. We'll call this the API folder. Under the API folder, we're going to have another folder because each of these are going to need to have several requests in them. So API notes, in the notes, we're going to add a request. It'll be a get request. This will be all notes will be the request. I can just call it all. I mean, it's under the notes folder, so if I just name it all, it should make sense. And we'll have it be localhost. Come on. Localhost :3000/API /notes. Hopefully my mic being a bit high didn't mess up the recording. No, we'll see. All right, and get all notes is a response right there. So we are up and running with both an auth router and an API router and a collection ready to go to begin testing these without too much issue. That is what I'm talking about, folks. Okay, so from here, I'm going to collapse these because those are now wired up and good to go, which is what I'm talking about. Collapse, close. Close and close. We'll get there eventually. Oh yeah, I remember we had installed a particular package that I said I like called Morgan. Let's go ahead and see what that one does here. I'll import Morgan from Morgan. There we go. And we are going to be logging any requests we have coming to any of our routes. So I don't really care about requests for our public folder directory, which sends our index file, etc. I mean, maybe you care. I don't particularly care. But again, order of importance is important. Order of the middlewares is important in what order they run, right? So if I add a logging middleware at the highest level of middlewares, then it will log requests to all things. If I want it to be specifically to the API folder only, I could choose to go to the routes index file and add Morgan in between these, or as a middleware just to the API router. But I want to actually log all routes, both auth and API, which again I could do from there, but I like adding top-level application middleware as well at the high level. We're going to call Morgan, and I believe we need to pass it the string of dev for development, and we can also change this to an environment variable that switches between dev and some other version for production, but for now I simply want it to be logging in a dev format, anything going to my routes. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. We're going to watch our terminal here in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and make 2 requests, one to get all notes, and then one to make a login request. Let's go check that out. Send. Cool. And check out our console logs, right? So this is what Morgan dev looks like. It tells us the method, the endpoint, the status code response, and the response times, right? So it's very, very nifty when you're trying to say in production, look at where traffic is going. You can have Morgan stream to something like, what's it called? There's a logging middleware, Winston, for Node or an Express. For Node in particular, there's a logging middleware we may include called Winston that moves things to a text file, or you can add it to a MySQL table. That way you can do some checking your server logs to see where you might be getting 404s if you wrote something incorrectly on the client, or 500 where the server is failing. It's just very nifty to help debug problems on your server, so I do advocate for it. Well, I like this middleware quite a bit. Other middlewares we're going to need is we're going to have to actually code a couple of different things for our server. So something I like to do personally, this has saved my behind more than once in the real world, where I'm wondering, is it a particular... has my server crashed completely, or is there simply a collection or singular route or endpoint that is causing a 500 error but not explicitly crashing my entire server? So if I get a request, or if I get like a text from my friend saying, hey, that pick league, that NFL pick league web app you built for us doesn't seem to be working, I can simply bring up my phone or something like that and test one of these endpoints to see what's actually happening. So what I like to do is always include the following. I call them status checkpoints, or like health checkpoints, right? They're the highest possible level requests you can make that are simply to /status that will simply do a rec res, because these will never fail. So I'm not going to do a try catch around them. That will simply send a status code of 200 OK if it's a successful get request to the status. And I also like to add one for the head method, right? So these status checkpoints are just useful in making sure that we can isolate where our problem is. Is the entire server down in production, or is there simply a collection of auth API routes, or even a singular endpoint that's 500 erroring for whoever texted me there's a problem? Or if you're like in the real world, you might get emails from your users, or maybe your coworkers are telling you some kind of internal tool is down. And if you wrote it, again, it's nice to know, is the whole thing down or just something in particular failing? So that's why I like to include those status checkpoints right there. Again, you don't know you'll want them until you use them and you're like, oh my goodness, that saved me. Thank you for that, by the way. No problem, future you. So something we need to account for. I like to have a global error handler for my servers, because I don't like, a lot of my students will follow what we do in the curriculum and never really question it, in the sense that they will wrap. Here's what a lot of my students will end up doing. And again, this is not necessarily wrong, but it does add for a lot of code bloat, and it makes it so you might not be consistent in error handling, which again, that's consistency reigns supreme when it comes to this kind of stuff. They'll add a try catch block around these things, and they might do the following. Res.status, this doesn't send a status code. This is different from send status. Status simply sets a status code of, say, maybe 500. And then they send a JSON response that might be the following: error, my code sucks. Especially, I like being self-deprecating. A lot of times they copy what I do, so this might seem very familiar. And this is something that, and they'll also typically console log what the error is as well, because they want to be able to debug it in development to take a look at it, right? So there's nothing wrong with this, and you have to simply remember to add this or copy and paste this try catch to literally every single route you write. But I can show you a more concise and consistent way to do something like this, right? So let's go ahead and make this throw an error and see what that ends up looking like. Throw new error. Test error, so that we can see what this ends up looking like. So this res JSON will never actually get called. It'll instead throw an error. This catch will catch the error, log what it is, and send the following. Let's have it send a sub object of message, my code sucks, and then also add whatever the error happens to be, like that. All right, so we have some nested objects going on here. Okay, let's go over to our API notes and make this error throw. So we're gonna get all notes by clicking on this tab and clicking send. Get all notes. There's the error. Didn't throw an error object. That's interesting, but let's go back over to our console log. Yeah, there's our test error message. I think it's because it couldn't JSON turn into JSON the error object. So let's just have it be the error message like that. And if I try again, boom, there we go. Now I got the error test message right there. Yeah, so that's how we can have this handle errors for us with try catch block. But like I said, there is a better way to do this. Let's go take a look at what that might look like. What I'm going to end up doing here first is I am going to, what I need to do is test it on the server level first, and then we will go back around and add it to our code, right? So what I mean by that is, hold on, I'm trying to find a note I had for myself somewhere to make sure, because I messed up something before and I want to make sure I don't do it again. Okay, that makes sense. All right, so when that error happens, right? It happens in our API notes file. And when this status response is sent, if I simply wrote the following instead, comment that out. It's control or command / if you didn't know that. Now you know. And we simply said, go to the next step in the process. That's what that next function is for these routes. It just simply moves it to the next middleware, the next route, the next piece of the puzzle. In Express lingo anyway. I guess that's how you say it. It will go to the next thing that it could possibly go to, which at the moment is, well, nothing. There is no next step after this endpoint. If there's no response sent and it pops back out here and it's like, well, there is no next step, so I don't know what to do. They'll probably just hang. But we can make a next step. And if I say, I want this app to have a global error handler, I can do the following. I can say app.use error express. We need a rec, res, and next, like that. And these need to be in parentheses now that I realize it. So wrap them up like that. And I see the TypeScript types aren't too happy about this. What we're actually going to end up having to do is telling it what these types are. Yep. I totally didn't mean that. There we go. This comes from the express.request object. This is the express.response object. This is the express.next function. So there we go. There are arguments for our little error handling middleware here. What I'm going to tell it to do is come down yonder into whatever code it ends up running and say the following. Log for me. My goodness, these autocomplete sometimes. Log what the error is so I know what's going on. Set a status on the response. Let's just do 500 for now. And then send a response of what the error message is. So I like sending objects. And let's do error message. And there we go. So when I write next error, and I include error before rec, res, and next, Express can recognize that as an error handling middleware. And so when I write next error in any one of my routes, which include all auth endpoints, all API endpoints, next will spit it back out from routes, come down here to the next step or next middleware, and universally handle errors consistently for me. Let's see if it worked, or if I'm just full of it. So there's error, test error, and it got thrown all the way out of that API notes file, caught by this middleware, and set up for us, which I think is freaking awesome. So, what else can we do? So there's an interesting quirk about Express that bugs me, but it is what it is. What does it do on not 500 errors? What if I have a 404 error? Meaning, what if I write notes with a Z instead of an S? Please pay attention to what its response is. The default response of Express when encountering a 404 error message is to send this lovely pre-coded HTML web page, because they're assuming that if it's a GET request to this API endpoint, that it's probably coming from a browser or a native app on a phone or something like that, which means that they'll send back some HTML to display this nice little simple error page that says cannot get API notes. My students will a lot of the times not recognize this error, this 404 error, because on their client-side code, they're simply getting something that says, hey, I'm trying to parse a JSON body response, and it's not working. Like the response.json of the fetch request is saying unexpected character in position 0 of JSON. That's a classic conundrum you might run in the front end, and that is because you are trying to JSON parse this HTML response. And, well, that simply ain't cool. I don't like that. Right? I don't like that at all. So we need to have some way to say, hey, if this error is a 404 error, I want to override the default HTML response and switch it over to a simple, nice-looking JSON response. So this is something that I also like to do in a lot of my Express projects, to make all my error handling as consistent as possible by setting up an JSON object with a key of error in it and whatever the error message happens to be. So this is doo-doo. Let's go fix it. We can do that by one step before this. This is going to handle all things when it comes to errors, but we need to have up catch 404s, catch all. That's what it's going to be logically here for, okay? So we're going to have another app.use. This can have the following, because we're not actually focused on catching the errors yet. We're simply saying if it comes out here, that means it's not matched anything inside of the routes of auth or API. So again, if it fails to match anything that's stacked inside of my routers, it will pop out here and be caught as a 404. And because I don't have anything coded, it will simply just kick it to Express. Express sends that HTML page. This purpose is to say, if nothing is matched, this should match it. And it will, because if nothing is matched here, our Express code will come out and look for any other routes that might match that path to send a response. This will be that catcher's mitt to say, hey, if it got here because it's a 404, let's set it up as such. So I need to make a new error, like so. And I'm going to interpolate a message into here that says, hey, rec.method, rec.original URL, so like get API / notes with a Z, not found. Okay? Now, I want to set a status property on the error object, which in vanilla JavaScript I could do, but error.status is not a thing that exists on the default error object as far as TypeScript is aware, right? So this is going to be something we'll have to worry about here in just a moment. And now I can simply say, go to the next step with this new 404 error. Down here, still console logging the error, which is fine. Res status, it no longer has to be 500 because it might be a 404 or something else that we set status code-wise. So we're going to say if it got here with an error status, use it, and if it's undefined or null or something like that, default to a 500 error, like so. Okay? So let's see what this ends up doing for us. So before, we got this nasty HTML page right here, but now we should be able to get something else. We should be able to get a 404 error. Let's check it out. There you go. Now we have a beautiful global error handler available for our lovely little application right here. That way we can really deduce what the problem is when it comes to these kind of things. And before, yeah, let's check it out. We got 404 status code, API notes not found. I dig it. That's what I'm talking about. Let's go back to notes with an S to see if the global error, if this is going to now be the same error or our test error that we have in that notes file. See, it skipped the 404 handler because it already had one, and it came out here to the global error handler, caught it, and displayed it in the exact same way, which means we are good to go, folks. Now, this looks kind of uggo out here in this particular project, so what I'm going to do is make a middlewares. In the middlewares folder, I will go to here and make an error handlers.ts file. And what we're going to do is copy and paste the code into error handlers. Now I need to reference the... Okay, yeah, what I need to do is the following. Import express from express, because these functions need to know what these types are. So I'll do express.request, express.response, and express.next function like that. There we go. Okay, now clearly I'm not adding them to my app here. So what I need to do instead is convert them. And how do I do that? Well, these need to be exported functions. Export const not found handler, we'll call it that, is a function that does the following. Move that curly brace, move that parentheses, there we go. So all I had to do is, at the end of the day, I mean, take a look at what this is. This highlighted code right here that goes in the app.use, it's just a function with some arguments in it and some code. I mean, we can argue that's all coding, but, you know, that's all it is at the end of the day. So back to convert it, let's move that parentheses, remove the app.use in first parentheses, and call this export const global error handler, and assign that arrow function to that variable. And as you can see, voila, we have, and I'm going to read these, I don't need these comments anymore because now that they have variable names for these functions, that I'm assigning, they're very on the nose of what they are. So I'm going to export them out as middlewares file, bring them in the server TS, import from middlewares. I'm not using an index here, right? Why is this erroring? Did I type it wrong? Middlewares. Why are you messing up on me? It's not nested somewhere by mistake, is it? No, it's definitely there. Server middlewares. Did I typo it? Oh, there's no index file. I even said... No, Luke, dummy, you even said that out loud. There's no index file in there, so I have to specify the name of the file. There we go. We're going to bring in the not found and the global error handler like so. And I'm simply going to come down here and say app.use the not found handler, app.use the global error handler, remove them comments, stack it all up because it makes sense that way now of stacking all of our middlewares on this app. And check it out. I have a very clean server entry point, which I like to keep it that way as best as possible. So what I'll go ahead and do is make the request to notes. Test error works just fine. Notes with a Z. 404 is just fine. Back to the S. Let's go remove that S from the notes API endpoint. I can remove the commented out code now because you can see how much more clean and consistent simply writing the following is going to be every single time. And let's confirm that it sends our get all notes response. That's what I'm talking about, y'all. Heck yes. Yes. All right. Now that that server is looking pretty beefy, what do we do next? Like I said, I might save. I'm probably going to save the MySQL part for the next part of the video. Yeah. I'll save it for the next part of the video. Anything else we need to include here? So I don't know if I need to talk about client-side routing and that being an issue yet. It will be when we get to the React portion of things, so I'll probably just leave it till then. And if you guys want, I mean, you could also consider, having status, because again, this is just two of the same thing, these functions right here. We could also move them to their own file if you wanted to, and maybe even this function right here, send it to a separate log if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter, but we've been going for what, like 40 minutes or something like that? I think that's long enough for part 2. And then part 3 is we're going to actually head into MySQL. So I'll mention this in part 3 as well. But in part 3, have MySQL server installed and your MySQL GUI of choice. I'm using Workbench. I need to switch something else that Andrew showed me. There's even extensions for VS Code that allow you to connect to a database and write SQL queries. We're going to keep it simple. We're simply going to make a users table, a schema for this project, a users table, and we're going to create a user to connect to our database with, and then we're going to make a user that we can then select information from and display things like a notes table and stuff like that. So yeah, get your MySQL stuff ready for the next video if you don't already have it. I have like 8.1 or 8.0 installed or something like that. I know in newer versions of MySQL, there are some authentication issues when it comes to certain libraries, the MySQL library in Node in particular. If you're on 5.x or anything that's like less than 8.1, then the next video will be easy to follow along with. If you're on higher than 8.1 in MySQL server, then you will have some issues trying to connect with it, which again, you'll have to Google your way to victory, but I will talk about that more in the next video. As always, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for your patience on this video. And I had some writer's block and some holiday depression, not gonna lie, but I had this new vigor because I want to make this project a portfolio-worthy project, not only for myself, but anyone else that follows along with this video series. So, yeah, ta-ta for now. This is Luke signing off.